Miraculous answers to prayer are a wonderful thing, but today it won't take a miracle for us to find out if prayer even makes a difference. Because whether you have faith or not, science is discovering that your biology might be more active than your theology for those who've chosen the path of living on a prayer. The science of prayer would seem like an oxymoron to some, but could there be truth to the idea that there are real benefits of prayer? I'm Dr. Nadine Plummer, and I am just a little skeptical. For millennia, prayer has been woven into the fabric of human health practices across diverse religions, serving as a type of bridge between the spiritual and the physical. In ancient traditions, shamans and healers invoked divine interventions for ailments. In indigenous rituals and early Hindu Vedic texts, mantras were chanted for healing and longevity. We see this relationship between prayer and health in several religions. For example, in Christianity's biblical accounts, we find Jesus' miracles through prayer. In Islam, we see dua supplications for recovery. In Buddhism, we find meditative prayers for mental clarity and these meditative prayers for bodily harmony. These all highlight a universal reliance on communion with the divine. Why? To combat illness. But while the efficacy for praying for others can be a subject of debate, recent science is actually showing remarkable benefits for that person who's praying themselves. Recent research shows prayer activating brain regions linked to empathy, linked to pain relief, linked to reduced inflammation, with participants experiencing up to 30% lower anxiety levels and up to 30% lower stress levels through simple practices like the rosary. Studies also link frequent prayers to longer telomeres, enhanced immune function, and even modest improvements in chronic conditions. Wow. This suggests that this ancient ritual may hold keys to modern health challenges. But let's hear what people think.
Prayer is your friend. You pray. You ask for whatever you're trying to accomplish, so you're laying off those worries to somebody else. So clearly, prayer is a friend.
Yes, definitely. I would like to share our own experience. Like whenever we start our vacation or whenever we have to go for exam, or like whenever we all friends go outside, we always start with the temple. The first thing we do is we visit our temple, and then we go to other places to visit.
Personally, yes, because I'm Muslim, so yeah, praying it does help a lot. You know, just even the Friday prayer, it helps a lot, like help relieve stress, calm up your head and stuff like that. Helps everyone. Yeah.
I feel as like a Muslim, it's mandatory to pray 5 times a day. So I feel like we always get our prayer in, and anything that you do for God, God will give back to you. So I feel like if you're stressed out, the best thing to do is pray to God. And once you pray or release stress, because God will know, but you always just got to follow what you got to do.
We also have to look at the scientific effects of prayer actually on the one who prays. We had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Andrew Newberg, who is often considered to be a pioneer in the science of neurotheology and prayer. Hi, Dr. Newberg. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your program.
I want to start with just a simple question, but a simple question that might have a deeper answer, and it's about prayer. I'm wondering, does prayer have any beneficial effects according to science?
I think in general, prayer does have a lot of beneficial effects for people. We have done a lot of studies looking at what goes on in the brain. Other studies have looked at its potential effect to help people with things like stress, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. And in general, these kinds of practices, spiritual practices, prayer practices, actually have a pretty substantial effect on the brain, and they ultimately can help people deal with a variety of issues that they're facing, and whether they are mental health issues or even physical health issues, being able to kind of calm the body down, calm the brain down, those kinds of effects can be very important for people and can be very helpful and very healthy for people.
So for you, what stands out as the most, let's say, unremarkable and maybe uncommonly known benefit of prayer?
Well, actually, I think there's a couple of important things that people need to realize. First of all, I've done a lot of brain scan studies of people doing spiritual practices, and I always think that one of the important things for people to realize is that there isn't just one part of our brain that is involved when a person engages in prayer. There are many different parts of the brain, and for anybody who has prayed, I think they would understand that because sometimes when you pray, you feel emotions. Sometimes you have certain ideas or thoughts. Sometimes you feel things in your body. And so if you actually think about how prayer affects us, it doesn't affect just one little part of our brain, but it affects virtually every part of our brain. And because our brain and our body are intimately connected, that means that these practices actually have a profound effect on the entire body. And in fact, when people are engaged in prayer, where they're feeling comforted and comfortable and it lowers their stress and anxiety, not only do we see changes in some of the emotional areas of the brain, but it changes how our whole body functions. It reduces the amount of stress hormones, hormones like cortisol. It reduces what's called our autonomic nervous system activity to go from a state of arousal and alertness to a state of calmness. And this ultimately has implications for how our body handles things like inflammation, infections, how it affects our metabolism. So what's kind of exciting is that it's not just one little thing that can happen from prayer, but many different aspects of prayer can affect many different aspects of our brain and our body.
Those are some remarkable benefits. Dr. Newberg, I was reading that you are a neurotheologist. Can you tell us what is neurotheology?
So neurotheology is an emerging field of study, a field of scholarship. Very simplistically, what it's about is trying to understand the relationship between our brain and our religious or spiritual selves. Now, that's the quick definition, but I think there's a couple of important things for people to realize. One is that I think for neurotheology to kind of work as a term and ultimately as a field of study, that we have to define the neuro side and the theology side very broadly. So the neuro side can include things like neuroimaging, neuroscience, but also include psychology, even anthropology, and medicine, all the ways that we get at kind of the biology of who we are, and particularly focusing on the brain. And theology, the other side of neurotheology, theology is a very specific discipline. It's really looking at a given tradition and trying to understand what the sacred texts are telling us and how we interpret it, how we make sense of it, and so forth. And we can look at all of those kinds of questions as well. We can look at theological questions and how our brain and even how our body kind of helps us to address those questions. But it also goes far beyond that. So it has to also be thought of very broadly and includes the topic of your program, the practices such as prayer, meditation, and so forth, and how they affect our brain and our body. It can include things like our beliefs and our belief systems and how they affect us, the different behaviors that we do if we want to become charitable, forgiving, altruistic. Those are all things that we can start to look at from this neuro side as part of neurotheology. So again, very importantly, neurotheology, I think both sides have to be thought of very broadly. And another thing that I think is very important for people to realize is that it really is a two-way street. It's not just neuroscience looking at religion. It's not just religion looking at neuroscience, but it's really the two of them kind of looking at each other to help us understand who we are as human beings. As you might mention in my introduction, I'm in the Department of Integrative Medicine, and so we think of the human person as being a combination of our biological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions. And so all of them are kind of working together to help us be who we are, to help us be healthy. And therefore, I think neurotheology can kind of help us to figure out what all of those interconnections are and how they kind of weave together to help us to be who we are, to help us to be human beings.
Do you know of recorded cases or maybe scientific cases of prayer being positively beneficial for the person who's being prayed for?
Well, one of the things that's interesting when you get into the discussion about prayer and health is that there are a lot of different kinds of prayer. Sometimes people are just praying. They may be just reciting a prayer, they're reciting the Lord's Prayer or something like that. That can almost be a kind of meditative type of process for them. Other people are having conversational prayer. They might engage in a conversation with God and talk to God and try to work through various issues or problems in their life through that process. The kinds of prayer that you're talking about are intercessory prayer, where you actually pray for someone, and maybe that person knows that you're praying for them. Maybe they don't know that you're praying for them. The research is actually quite fascinating, and there are a number of studies which have shown that intercessory prayer sometimes can be beneficial for people. There's been studies where they looked at people praying for other individuals in a hospital setting, for example, and found that people seem to get out of the hospital a little earlier, have fewer side effects from the treatments that they might be engaged in. Not all the studies have been positive. But I think, from a scientific perspective, it's quite fascinating for us to think about what this means, how we can understand it. And I think, there are always different methodological challenges when it comes to doing this kind of research. It might be very different if somebody is praying for kind of an unknown individual, maybe just given a name or something like that, versus somebody who's praying for their mother or their child or something along those lines. So the bottom line is that while there's some very interesting research out there that has shown some positive effects, there's a long way to go for us to learn what exactly is going on, if those results hold up, and what that may tell us about the effects of how our mind, how various practices like meditation and prayer can actually affect not only ourselves, but others around us. And hopefully that's, again, another very interesting area for neurotheology to help us try to figure out how all of these different practices affect us as human beings, and what they really mean for us in terms of how we understand the human person, our mind, our consciousness, our soul. These are some fascinating questions for us to be able to explore from the perspective of neurotheology.
You had just mentioned a few different types of prayer. For example, maybe meditation versus something like route prayer, or maybe Christian prayer. I'm wondering about the effects of prayer on the person praying, like in terms of a biological effect or a neurological effect. For example, if someone is saying, and I know that you're doing brain scans as well, if someone is saying route prayers versus a meditative prayer, what's happening biologically or neurologically within that person who's praying? Are there differences based on the prayers themselves?
Well, these are some fascinating questions, and we have studied in my own lab a lot of different kinds of prayer practices. Maybe the best way to answer your question about how do those practices affect us is what I like to say is that there are many different parts of our brain that all kind of interconnect together, what might be called a network of structures in our brain that become involved when people pray. Now, how we access that network and what parts of the network become more active or more prominent depends on what the person is doing. If someone is just simply repeating a prayer over and over again, well, maybe you're going to activate some of the language centers of your brain, some of the concentration areas of the brain that are areas of the brain such as the frontal lobe. But maybe that would be it. Whereas if a person is getting into a very deep spiritual prayer, and maybe they start to feel powerful feelings of joy, love, emotion, maybe they have some kind of almost, intense spiritual or mystical experience, then they might see other kinds of changes going on. For example, when people pray and they feel a sense of connectedness, either between themselves and maybe the person they're praying for, or between themselves and God, then one of the things that we have seen in the brain scans is that an area of the brain in the back of our head called the parietal lobe actually starts to quiet down. And that's kind of interesting because the parietal lobe normally takes all the information that comes into our brain from the outside world and helps us to kind of create a spatial representation of ourself and where ourself is in the world. But when people engage in very intense prayer practices where they lose that sense of self, they feel that sense of connectedness, then what we actually start to see is that area begin to decrease. And I think that as it decreases, that sense of self and the boundary between ourself and the rest of the world starts to go away. And that's where we start to feel this very powerful sense of oneness or connectedness. So again, not everybody feels that in every kind of practice, but those are the kinds of changes that we can see.
That's interesting because I was going to say we've talked about the benefits of prayer, and my next question was going to be, what are the negative aspects of prayer? But you're saying just the state of mind that you're in and the types of things that you're praying for and that emotion that you have, whether you're filled with the emotion of love, believing that there's something loving that's receiving your prayer, or you're filled full of discord, that actually acts as a mirror, and then you will be more loving or you will be more angry, etc. Are there negative aspects to prayer aside from that you've heard of, or studies that you're aware of?
Well, again, I mean, I think the main thing that people have to be aware of are just when prayers do turn negative, both in terms of the ideological elements of them. The other thing that people can sometimes be aware of is that sometimes prayer practices can become frustrating. If you're trying to do something, if you're hoping for certain kind of experience and you're not getting it, then it can become frustrating for a person. And so that is also something to watch out for. We tend to see that more in meditation practices where people are told to quiet their mind and they feel like they can't do it or something like that. One of the things that I think is important for people to realize again is that prayer practices and meditation practices, it's never that it's never going to be the same every single time. And there are going to be times where you're going to go to church and you've had a rough day or you've had an argument with somebody and you're just not into it as much. And so probably you're not going to get as much out of it that day as you will in general. But again, what people hope to ultimately accomplish through that is to continue the process and continue to hopefully try to find those positive elements that become part of that. Short of that, I mean, the only other very unusual circumstances are when people engage in extremely intense practices. These could be monks or something like that who are praying hours and hours a day. Whether or not that ultimately can cause unusual effects on the brain or unusual experiences or even things like hallucinations. There's a few case reports of that kind of thing. But I think for the large majority of people who are just engaging their practices, who like to do their prayer practices, who make it a part of their daily lives, again, as long as the ideological elements are positive and focusing on love, compassion, and so forth, and helping each other and helping themselves and trying to be the best person that they can be, those are the kinds of experiences and practices that are, for the most part, are going to be fairly universally positive.
Wow, that's amazing. Just, I think the note there is when you're praying, focusing on love and compassion. Are there studies showing other overall benefits? Let's say some of our viewers are thinking of maybe incorporating prayer and they don't pray normally. Overall health benefits or ways their lives might change. I mean, the dopamine levels are great just by praying regularly.
Well, yes, and I think one of the things that I do get asked a lot about is what kind of practice should I do? I think it's important for people to start with, well, what are my goals, and who am I? So if somebody has strong beliefs in a particular tradition, then looking to the practices of that tradition makes a lot of sense. If people are struggling with that and they want to look for other alternatives, obviously there are a lot of alternatives out there. And people can think about trying to look at to explore other options, other types of practices. There doesn't have to be kind of a one size fits all for each person. And maybe people say, you know what, I like prayer and I like being in church, but I love being in the mountains. I love walking in the forest. So do the prayer practice in the mountains, in the forest. So it doesn't have to be just one way of doing things, at least as far as deriving these kinds of health benefits. And again, I mean, if somebody really enjoys conversational prayer, then that's the kind of prayer that they should try to at least do more often than other types of prayer. If they really enjoy rituals, then they should do more of the ritualistic practices. So they have to think a little bit more about what they respond to, what they like, what feels good to them, and then ultimately try to create a kind of approach and a program for them that works the best for them. But again, that does have a lot to do with just each person and how and what are the goals of that person, to have conversations with other friends, family who are doing things, have conversations with pastors, ministers to say, this is what I'm working with. This is what I'm trying to accomplish. What are the best ways of trying to do this? In fact, going back to our retreat study, one of the elements of that is to meet with a spiritual guide who talks to you about what's coming up for you, what are you thinking about, what are where, how, and kind of helps the person develop themselves as part of that prayer process. So I think that those are probably the most effective approaches for people to take, to try to understand who you are, what your own goals are, and then to seek out practices that are consistent with that, consistent with your beliefs, consistent with what you're trying to accomplish. And then you kind of go down those paths, and always being a bit mindful of when the path seems to diverge off in directions that may be problematic, to see where that's going, and to ask for the help when you can, when you need it, to find the best ways of keeping the path as appropriate as possible for each one of you.
So thank you for that answer, Dr. Newberg. Specifically looking at maybe different religions and different types of prayer, looking at a Christian prayer versus an Islamic prayer, have you noticed a change in the brain during those prayers?
So, in addition to our studies of different Christian prayers, yes, we did do a brain scan study of Islamic prayer. And one of the interesting things that we saw in that particular practice was a pretty substantial decrease of activity in the frontal lobes of the brain. That is very consistent with what they're describing. The basis of Islam is to surrender oneself to God. And so I think that would be very consistent with the idea of having a decrease in frontal lobe activity. Now, again, if there was a Christian monk or nun who engaged in a practice where they felt a kind of surrender and kind of being pulled into the experience, then we would expect to see a similar kind of decrease. So it's not necessarily the tradition itself so much as what the person is doing and what they seem to be experiencing as part of that process. And again, all of these practices are ultimately dynamic. And in that regard, it may be that, had we allowed the people doing Christian prayer to go longer, so to speak, to a point where they felt that they released themselves or surrendered to the experience, maybe we would have seen a similar kind of drop as what we saw in Islamic prayer. But again, I think the ultimate results of all of this is that these practices do seem to affect our brain a little bit differently. They all seem to engage this set of structures of the brain, this network of structures in the brain a little bit differently. And it depends on the person, it depends on what they're doing, and it depends on what they're experiencing. All those different elements play a role in helping us understand what's going on within our brain. Again, if somebody was doing a prayer practice, and didn't really feel much of an emotional response, they just were kind of doing the prayer, we probably wouldn't see the emotional centers of the brain becoming very active. On the other hand, if a different person does the same prayer and they feel a powerful feeling of joy or awe or some very, very intense, emotion of love, then we would expect to see areas of the brain's emotional centers that help us to feel those feelings, those emotional feelings, become much more active. And we have seen that in our research studies. So it's a fascinating exploration of the complexity of what prayer ultimately is.
So that's really amazing. Two people could say the exact same prayers, and yet two different things happening in their brain depending on their beliefs, how engaged they are, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, you imagine two people listening to the same piece of music, and some people it doesn't do that much for, and other people are, have just incredible, are moved to tears. So they're listening to the same thing, but they have a completely different reaction to it.
Amazing. Dr. Newberg, thank you so much for your time today. How can people follow up with you and follow up with your work on prayer?
If they want to, they can come to my website, which is andrewnewberg.com, or they can follow me and my own explorations on Instagram. It's at Dr. Dr. Andrew Newberg.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Newberg. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That was some fantastic and unexpected information on prayer. But we can't make decisions based only on what sounds good. In this show, We make them on the weight of the evidence. So let's let the chips fall where they may. Scientists have discovered that the length of our telomeres is correlated with the length of our lives. Epidemiological data associates regular prayer, among other religious activities, with increased telomerase activity, up to 84% in related lifestyle studies. This therefore showed that prayer potentially slows cellular aging and reduces chronic disease risk. However, negatives have also been associated with prayer. Specifically, in one particular study, subjects were told that they were being prayed for, and when they were told that they were being prayed for, it was right before heart surgery. Those subjects experienced elevated levels of anxiety. When researchers looked at those who were clinically depressed, they noted that prayer invoked a marked decrease in feelings of depression, combined with an increase in optimism and religious experience. It was discovered that not all prayers produce the same effects. The work of Dr. Andrew Newberg shows that particularly in Islamic prayer, the prefrontal cortex experiences a major decrease in blood flow, whereas in Christian prayer, there was observed an increase in blood flow and activity in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. In preliminary studies, intercessory prayer influenced epigenetic markers like stress-regulating genes, improving immune function by 10 to 15% in some prayed-for groups, even when people were actually prayed for remotely. Studies also show frequent prayer lowers C-reactive protein, which is an inflammation marker, and that lowering was by 15 to 20% in lonely individuals, comparable to social support interventions. Finally, fMRI studies show petitionary prayer, meaning asking for help from God or a higher power, increases activity in theory of mind brain areas by 12 to 18%. These areas include the prefrontal cortex, the temporal parietal junction, the posterior cingulate cortex, as well as others. Prayer is a lot more beneficial than maybe we all realized. So, when it comes to the benefits of prayer, I am no longer a skeptic. My friends, enjoy prayer, and please remain selectively skeptical.